All right, guys, we're going to talk today about rotations, so make sure that you have all the stuff filled out in your guided notes packet. Same thing that we've been working on in terms of our graphs, just different skill. All right, so a rotation is a turn. Turns are measured in 90 degrees. So that means if I have, let's say, this triangle, and I want to rotate it, it might end up looking something like that based on my degree turns. If a problem is asking you to turn your figure 90 degrees, that just means one turn. 180 degrees is two turns. 270 degrees is three turns. Turns can be clockwise or counterclockwise. And here is where today we really need to understand what origin means, because every problem is going to ask you to rotate around the origin, and the origin is just the point 0, 0 on the graph. It's the middle of the graph. All right, let's move on. Okay, guys, these are steps to rotations. I'm not going to really talk about them. Obviously, you can read them and they're already written down in your notes, but I'm going to go through each one of these when I start doing examples, so make sure that you pay attention to them, follow these steps every time, and you will nail recordings. All right, let's move on.
All right, guys, let's very quickly go over what clockwise and counterclockwise means. If I'm going to rotate my figure clockwise, I'm going to move it like the hands of a clock, just like a clock goes to the right. If I'm going to go counterclockwise, I'm going to go the opposite way. So when I say let's turn our paper 90 degrees clockwise, that means we're going to do one full turn to the right. So I'm going to take my paper and I'm going to turn it one full turn to the right. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's say I wanted to do 180 degrees counterclockwise. Counterclockwise means I'm going to go to the left. So I'm going to take my paper, turn it two full turns to the left. All right, let's move into our first example. First figure, we're going to rotate it 180 degrees clockwise. 180 degrees tells me I'm going to be doing two turns, and clockwise tells me I'm going to be turning my paper to the right. Now, my very first step is to turn the graph the number of turns. Well, we just said it was going to be two turns and that it was going to be to the right. So I'm going to take my paper and turn it two times to the right. 1, 2. My next step is that I'm going to relabel my graph. So this is my y-axis, this is my x-axis. This doesn't have to be beautiful, but you do have to be able to see all of your points. So this becomes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And you see how I'm just relabeling my graph. That's all I'm doing. Nothing super crazy. Okay, and then -1, -2, -3, -4, -5, -6. My next step is to write down the coordinates of my triangle A, B, and C from my new graph that I just did with my turns. So C is now at -1 and -2. B is at 3, -2. And A is at 3, -7. Now that I have these coordinates written, I'm going to turn my paper back to normal. And I'm also going to rewrite my coordinates here so we can see them a little bit easier. 3, -7, 3, 2, 1, -2. Okay, now my next step is simply to plot these coordinates on my original graph. So now I'm going to ignore all the numbers in red, and I'm going to plot the points on the original graph. So A was at 3, -7. So I'm going to go to 3 on my x value, and I'm going to go down to 7. And I'm going to label that A prime. Be very sure that you are labeling as you go, or you're going to get confused. B was at 3, -2. So I'm going to go to 3, and go down to -2. That becomes B prime. C is at -1, -2. So I'm going to go to -1 on my x value and -2 on my y value. That becomes C prime. My last step here is just to draw my lines. And that's it. That's 180 degrees clockwise. Let's do another example. It's going to do something different to it. This time we're going to rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise. 90 degrees tells me it's just going to do one turn, and counterclockwise tells me I'm going to go to the left. So my first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to turn my graph one turn to the left. Now, my next step is to relabel my graph. So this now becomes my y-axis, and this becomes my x-axis. And I'm going to now ignore the numbers in black. I'm going to write my own numbers. And these numbers in red are the ones that I'm going to use.
Notice that while Ms. Abel is labeling her graph, she's not going over the black numbers because we're going to need those. Instead, she's just adding new numbers to help her figure out her new translation.
That was Miss Way, by the way. Alright, the next thing I'm going to do, now that I have my new graph, I don't care about my black numbers anymore, I'm just using my red numbers. So I'm going to start at my origin, which is still 0, 0. And now I'm going to write down the coordinates of my triangle using my red numbers. Alright, so let's just start with A. A is at, I'm going to go over to what is now -7, since that's the red number I'm using, -7, and down to what is now -3 for my y value. B is at what's now -2, and down to -3, which is my y value. And C is now at -2 for my x value and 1 for my y value. Now that I have these coordinates written, my next step is to turn my paper back to normal. Turn my paper back to normal. And I'm going to write our coordinates here so we can see them. And my last step is just to plot these points using my original graph. Now I don't care about the numbers in red. I'm going back to the original graph and using my numbers in black to graph them. So A is at -7, -3. I'm going to go over to -7 on my x-axis and down to -3. I'm going to plot that point. That's going to become A prime. Again, make sure you're labeling your graph, your figure as you go, or you're going to get confused. B is at -2, so I'm going to go over to -2 and down to my y value of -3. And that becomes B prime. Lastly, C is at -2 and 1. So again, not using my numbers in red, still in black. I'm going to go to -2 and then up to my y value of 1. And that becomes C prime. My last step here is just to connect the dots of my triangle. And that's it. We've now rotated this figure 90 degrees counterclockwise, which makes sense because it's going opposite the way a clock would go. Alright guys, that's going to be it for me. Let's practice.